Good morning. Anybody hear me? Cool. Then I don't have to put on the microphone. All right. Good morning. Welcome to the tent. My name is Nelson Blankenship. I'm a member of the Collections Department at National Aerospace Museum. I am the chief of the Preservation and Restoration Unit, which is currently at the Udvar Ozzie Center. I shouldn't say currently, we've always been there. So this morning we're going to have a little presentation on how do we go through the processes of doing a large artifact treatment. It's a very specific thing. It's got very specific standards and protocols, and it involves a lot of people in the museum. All right, so as I mentioned, there's standards and protocols. So in general, we're members of the Alliance of American Museums and AIC, the American Institute of Conservation. We also have internal standards that are built within the Smithsonian, what are called directives. And then within the museum and the departments themselves, we have further, more delineated policies on when it comes to dealing with the care of artifacts. So, what are these protocols? So, the main purpose of the protocols are the ethics of how to treat artifacts in a way that doesn't do any harm to them. Our main purpose is to do the care for the artifacts and do them so that they'll really be preserved. So, like I mentioned, we have internal policies. An example of one that we do all the way down to the level in the restoration shop, documentation. We have a standardized form that we use and we fill in, we add pictures to for all aspects of treatment. We'll start off by bringing in the artifact. We'll do an assessment by doing analysis of what its condition is. We'll take pictures of that original condition as we receive it, and that all goes down and it gets saved and gets into a database as we go along and we finish. So the principles here, up until recently, museums that do technological treatment on clocks, cars, trains, aviation equipment, they didn't follow the same protocols of, say, art and art history, cultural aspects. So, but more and more, the technological museums are embracing more and more of the aspect of conservation and preservation. So, one aspect that we'll get asked a lot about is conservation versus restoration. Why do we do it? So, we want to make sure what we're working on, what's in our charge and our responsibility, will be there for the future generations. So, if we start doing things that are just restorative, we start to remove aspects that are historical. So that's kind of one of the guiding principles. And we could go into detail in this 15-minute thing here. I could spend an hour or two just talking about this aspect alone. We'll be here all week. I'll just put that out there. If you want to ask more details, I'm more than, and any of us are more than willing to answer any of these questions in more detail to any degree you want. So, examples. What's exhibitable? So you got the Bugatti, right? They pull it out of the lake and they put it on display as it is. You've got the Warhawk in the Egyptian desert. It gets pulled out, they restore it, they stick it outside with the engine still sitting underneath. So, philosophically, what's the better approach for the effect of what you've done to the artifact? So these are just a couple examples. So, I think most modern people and folks in artifact care would agree that this is the better approach. Again, we agree it's philosophical, but we believe in this. In order to have done what they did here, they had to remove a lot of the things that were there that were provenance to the aircraft. So I use this as an example. If you were to buy a piece of antique furniture and someone's completely stripped it down and restripped it, repainted it to their desire, is it more valuable now than it was when it still had all the original stain or paint on it? What's more valuable? And why do we have that more value for what was original? Because whether we want to admit it or not, we all do value what is authentic. So this is more authentic than this. I think most people can agree on that. Now these are just examples. Here in the aviation field with aircraft, what we see, we can see and have those philosophical conversations on many, many, many of them. Ideal museum aircraft. Spirit of St. Louis. Everybody here has seen that, right? So it does its famous flight in 1927. He does his tour when he gets back in 28, and he flies it directly to the museum. And it's been with the museum since 1928. In 2016, we brought it down to do some work on it. We started to notice that there was some fabric tearing, but we didn't have to touch it much from 28 to 16. We reserved it. Now, the environment we preserved it has gotten better and better and better in each museum that we've opened, and each time we've done air conditioning, humidity control, it's gotten better. But the main thing is we preserved that history from the 20s until this century. We've had to go back and do some minor fabric repair because the original dope continued to pull. And one of the things they did when they did the repairs in 27, when he landed in Paris and then we landed again in London, that when the crowds rushed in and they tore fabric off of it, you know, they went from cotton to linen or vice versa, and one tears easier than the other when you dope it. And then we actually didn't know that that effect was happening until we got it back down and we get to look at it. Which is, you know, that's another sign for us. If it's something hanging, we need to go look at it more often. Especially something as precious as this with cloth fabric. But this was put in place, the point of this conversation is it was put in place as was. We didn't have to do any alterations to it. So it was an aircraft you could display as is, and it's historic. You don't have to change anything to tell that story. It is what it is. Now, this is not an unusual situation for any aviation museum on how they're going to receive an aircraft. So, this is a situation where you're probably, if it's one of many or multiple, it's not the first, it's not the last, someone famous didn't fly. So with this, you're probably going to do a restoration approach. So then it's a matter of how much do you restore, to what do you restore to tell the story. And I think if you talk to other aviation museums around the country and around the world, this kind of artifact condition is not unusual, especially in the last 40 years for how you would receive it. So projects at National Air Space Museum, like I said, I'm a part of collections department. So I'm the preservation and restoration unit. We have people in the conservation unit. These are folks who have postgraduate degrees in material research. They work side by side with us. We work hand in hand on all these projects. We have folks here from the collections processing unit. We call them CPU. They deal with all our handling, our documentation of movement and the actual movement, and all the care that's involved with that. They work hand in hand with us. And we also have a registrar's office, which deals with all the legal aspect of acquiring, deaccessioning, loaning, bringing in and out loans, and all the databases that track all of our artifacts. And we also work with the exhibits department. We work with our exhibits designer, our production folks that make mounts. We work hand in hand with the curator. We're going to get more involved with what the curator does here. We'll also talk about the archivists. We have some archivists here this week. We have some curators here this week. We'll discuss a little bit about what they do. But it's truly a team effort to deal with any of these treatment programs and these projects that we deal with at the museum. Access the artifact. So just take this as a general, it's not exact. Every artifact, every treatment, every thing you receive has a different approach depending on what the artifact requires. But this is just a general example of how we would go through it. P61 is now on display there at Uber Hazy. That's what this is here. So you want to study it, determine its current condition, we talked about that. Investigate its history. So who's going to investigate the history? The curator is going to do that. They're going to start with that. And then the restoration folks and the conservation folks, they'll do some more research on history. The archivists might have to do some research on history to provide us the data that are manuals and things of that sort that we need. Identify modifications. So quite often, in fact, it's quite normal for an aircraft or space, more aircraft than spacecraft, including this aircraft. When we get it, it had a long life. It went through various iterations of usages and maybe different owners. It may have started off as a warbird. It might have become a firefighter. It might have become an observation aircraft. It might have become an NACA airplane. And those various iterations of its life created different modifications to the fuselage, the wings, the engines, what have you. So you need to understand that and know that before you start your treatment process. So that's going to be part of what you're identifying. Chronology that changes. The chronology matters because the curator who's going to want you to restore or preserve this artifact, in this case an aircraft, they're going to have a display goals. So what are their display goals? Is it the NACA version? Is it the war version? You need to know that, because then it's going to form part of your strategy of what you're going to restore to. What changes should be made in reverse? Some changes you really can't make, because if they're structural and we're going to suspend it from somewhere, well, then you got to take that into account. Is it going to be up on poles? Is it going to be mounted? Can the fabric structurally withstand where we're going to put it and how long we're going to put it? These are considerations. That's all part of the final, clarifying the final object. That's that final goal. Create a schedule. So I jokingly have told people all week, if this was a family business, National Air Space Museum, and I was going to pass down this work to my great-grandchildren, they wouldn't even begin to get near finishing all the work we have lined up to do at the museum. And we can discuss that with you in great detail. We've been talking about that when you come visit our locations. We have lots of work to do and limited resources and people. So the scheduling part of that's important, because where do we bounce people from project to project? When folks were in here yesterday and we were talking about flak bait, that actually comes into play. Well, why flak bait were or where it isn't yet in the completion of that project, because we had to switch over to our priorities of working on the mall building objects, so that hurt our schedule. Choose the right team. Well, if it's a cloth-covered plane, we're going to redope and we're going to put new fabric on it. Who are the folks that are best skilled at that? Do we need other people to come and be on the team so they can learn those skills? So you're going to build your team depending on the schedule timeline you got, the resources you have, but you're also going to use the team that are the subject matter experts. Back to earlier on this board, you see the Storm of it, which we finished last year, and it's now sitting down in the new World War II gallery. We chose people to be on that team for certain skill sets because of the wood that had to be done on that. And that paid off. It allowed us to do that project in a 2.5 year period and put out a product we're very proud of. All right, this is another general guideline. I've actually shortened it since we started giving out this presentation in April. This used to be 6 steps. The 6th step actually would have been brought and put back in for this audience, because the 6th step would be the last step, which would be an option to restore the fly. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that for us at the museum, this is typically the range of options we're going to have, because at the National Aerospace Museum, we rarely, if ever, restore anything to where it's flight worthy. Again, going back to flak bait, we talked about yesterday. I get asked this all the time about flak bait. You're going to make it so it can fly, right? No. The goal of that project is to restore it so that when it's done, it looks to you when you come visit it just like it did in 1946 when it got to the park. The paint, the grease even, the mud in the wheel wells, that's all being preserved as a time capsule so that you see what a B-26 Marauder that's been worn out from war activity, what it looked like. And that's the time capsule we're saving for you. So that would be to the extent we go. The most extreme we would go to would be, we're going to completely restore it to look like a version of it. In fact, we're doing one right now in the restoration effort. We got a Lincoln Standard Hispano-Suiza J1. That's a mouthful, but that mouthful tells you exactly what the history of that aircraft is. It started off as a standard J1 in World War I. It was a contemporary of the Jenny. But our aircraft never made it to the war theater. Lincoln Company in Nebraska, they take it, they modify it and turn it into a 3-person aircraft, and then it becomes a barnstorming airplane, then it becomes an observation airplane for an oil field down in Texas. It flew until '64. But there's Lincoln standards out there. Ours wasn't flown by anyone famous. It wasn't the first, it wasn't last, it wasn't a technological leap. It's a standard one that there's a lot of examples of. So that gave us the leeway on that one to restore it to a specific time period for a specific purpose. It's going in that very gallery right there. The last thing that gets put into the transformation project is in that gallery. It'll be our Lincoln Standard. It goes right there along on poles. And the reason it's going there is the curator chose it to tell the barnstorming story of the 1920s. While our standard flew until 1964, multiple owners, multiple refurbishments to keep it flying. But in the 1920s, it didn't have some of the technology on it that it came to us with from 1964. So to be accurate, kind of like we were accurate with the IL-2, we're telling you that's a 1920s aircraft. So whereas we're restoring it, and it is a restoration project, we're restoring it to 1920s vintage correct use of hardware, use of material. An extreme example is all your wires, your bracing going between the bow wings and your flight controls. When it was originally made, it would have used a Navy 5-wire duct to do the wire splicing. You know, the one we received, it had Inconel splices holding the wires together. Well, that technology wasn't available in the 20s. So we had to have one of our specialists, he pulled out the tool. We had a tool in our collection, the actual tool to do display it. He unspun it. Well, first he had to spend several weeks practicing because no one was doing it right in the world anymore when we got into manuals. We found people all around the world offering to do that cables for us with that technique. And when we got them, they're like, they weren't by the manual. So we had to reinvent the wheel, a process people weren't doing anymore, to do it per what the specs were all the way into the 40s. So he was playing with the tools with wires. He looked like he'd been fighting porcupines actually, because all the wires got him. But he perfected the technique. So we've made all new cables for the length standard will be period correct. That's just an example. So when we point at something, we say that's 1920s and we're the Smithsonian. It's got to be accurate. So that comes into play what you're doing here. So I'm just going to go through this real quick. This is just those 5 steps. Passive treatment. An example of this would be, and yes, you can hold your questions on that until after. The Space Cultural Discovery, sitting there behind the SR-71 at Udvar-Hazy. That is and has received a treatment in the sense that it's sitting in that environment. The Udvar-Hazy Center is in a world-class museum environment. The humidity, temperature, the lighting, the airflow, everything about it, the fact that it gets clean is in a preserved environment. The treatment on the Discovery is a preservation. When NASA arranged and required us to take it, it came to us with the goal to preserve it as was. They asked us post-flight, would we like it to have all these tiles cleaned and replaced on it, like they do after every flight? Our response was no. The other 2 science centers that took it, they had their own display factors. We wanted to display as it looked like this post-flight. This is what we want to preserve for you to see. We want you to see what a spacecraft goes through when it re-enters. So that's the goal here, is to preserve that. And that environment does that. It gets regular, and I mean regular, analysis and restudy for its current condition. Is there any degradation? Are the struts holding up? All that. It gets that care. So this is an example of a passive preservation. Passive being that it's sitting there in the correct environment. Then as you walk away through this, you get more invasive as you go. So now we're going to start to add conservation techniques. I've got a piece of sheet metal that's got aluminum degradation. It's corroded. So the Tsurugi, which is ours, it belongs to us, it's down in Gima. These aircraft were made for one flight. The Japanese made them, they're made out of just common plywood. It gets you up, you go do your thing, you've done your mission. So this is an example. Would you go and replace all that? Would you replace all that wood? If you do that, you've lost what is the thing that's history. So in this case, you might do some conservation application of chemicals, waxes, solvents to lightly halt any degradation that's continuing. Then you're going to put it into that preserved museum atmosphere to let it stay in that locked-in position. So the first thing on this one, if you didn't go in and halt the wood rot or the paint loss or corrosion without some interactive conservation technique, it was going to continue to have loss. So this is the next step. You're going to preserve it, but you're also going to add some conservation techniques. Minor structural repairs and mechanical stuff. Well, in order to put it on display and let it hold itself up, I might need a repair. I'll give you an example. Early flight aircraft's got broken ribs, and you're going to have to reseal the fabric on it. If you don't fix the ribs, it structurally won't hold and it'll collapse on itself. So to put that on display, you have to make that structural. The B-38, our B-38 sitting right next to the Enola Gay right there at Udvar-Hazy. The goal on this, again, was to show a B-38 the way it looked in use in the war. We had crew chiefs that worked on this. They came in and the memories started flooding back in their head because what they saw there was they saw the aircraft the way it looked when they worked on it. This is how a P-38 looked like when you were in theater. As someone who spent 30 years in DoD, they don't fly them here. We do not fly them looking that way. They have the grease streaks and the mud on them regularly. So this allowed us to do much less invasive approach on. So we had to do some minor repairs, we had to actually add some hardware back that was missing that were period or vintage correct. So it was actually very little work to do this. Again, it's in Uberhazy, it's in a preserved environment. So as you see, we're starting to work our way more invasive. We're going to do more and more structural repair, more and more interactive with the paint. The Heinkel. Is everybody here familiar with the HE-219? The only one left in the world currently. I say currently because there was one organization trying to reproduce one. So this is one of three that made it to America after the war. This is the German night fighter. Every Air Force, major Air Force in the war, in World War II, were all developing night fighters at the same time. And it's kind of interesting when you study, we're all developing radar and technology for the same purpose independently, and we're actually pursuing the same things. So what you got here is you got a radar in this avionics back there, you got the array up front here. Actually, I should put a new picture because it's actually sitting there with the array on it now, and it makes it much better. But this is a project that we were allowed to work on the side. We worked it for about 23 years, and it's out on the floor now in the access corral at Uberhazy, and it looks really nice. The only thing left on is the flaps. We got to do some corrosion treatment on the flaps, but everything else is done. The paint, but we had to do structural repairs on the wings. The paint had to be redone. And yes, we're aware of the debate on the paint color. We're well aware of it. But it was more invasive than, say, the P-38. We received in pieces. In fact, we think this is actually a combination of the three aircraft. So these aircraft went to Pax River down in southern Maryland. And when they were done testing with them, what was the remains of two of them, they shoved off into the bay in the early 50s. And what was left was Smithsonian. And we did have everything for the most part. A couple of switches and stuff missing in the cockpit. We had everything on this aircraft to put it back together, except for the radar mast that went on the front. So what did we have to do to restore that? Paul Allen's group at the time, they had pulled the one out of the drink up off the coast of Norway that got ditched at the end of the war. He recovered it. He wanted to come out and scan this, so we did a sharing agreement with them. They were able to come out and 3D scan everything on ours. He brought the radar mask from their museum to us. We were able to use our x-rays and scan it. And from that, we were able to reverse engineer the radar mask all the way out to the tips. The radar masks that are on our aircraft on display right now, they include the wiring, the coax cable, all the connectors. You can't see all that detail, but it's all there. So it's authentic. And we actually didn't have the Heinkel drawings for that. We would have done it from the drawings, but that's one thing that we didn't make it after the war. That particular radar system, we can't find any drawings on. So again, with the paint and everything, this was more invasive. Another example. Everyone knows this. This is hugely popular at the mall building. If there's a hint that we're going to move this, you would not believe the amount of press that we have to deal with that we've touched the Starship and not the model. So this is the model from the 1960 show. It is the model. When the studio was done with it, they actually restored it once or twice themselves for their own display purposes. And when we received it, we found that they had altered it quite a bit. So we had to go back to what was the original structural design and replace it and fix all that. And then it was back in our conservation shop when we were restoring the model down there. And so it did have to have some internal structural repairs to take it back to the 1960s original model design. We had to repair all the lights that weren't working when we got it. So all that got fixed. Restoration. Okay, so this is probably about the max that most of the ones we would ever get max to in our restoration shop. So the Enola Gay. So I got asked this question yesterday, and I just took for granted that not everyone knows the full life of the Enola Gay. So the Enola Gay and her sister ships, when they're done with the bombing missions in Japan, the Air Force takes them back into the inventory, and they think they're not going to use them for nuclear bombing anymore. So they turned them back to be a regular B-20, B-29. So, you know, there was like, they were heavily modified on the line to drop those bombs, and then they demodified them and they made them kind of a normal B-29. Well, of course, the story we want to tell at the NOLA Gate when we put on display views, we want to tell the day of the bomb was dropped story. So this was the longest, and I don't remember, so don't hold me this, I don't remember the number of hours between NASM staff and NASM volunteers, and it was a huge collaborative effort. There's tens of thousands of hours that went into the NOLA Gate to get her back together and on display at Udvar. So this is the picture of her when she got assembled for the first time since she'd been taken apart at Udvar on the floor in 2003 before we filled it all in. And she's now up on these ginormous yellow stands. But that's one where we restored it back to a specific day here at Woodford Gold. And it took a lot because over the years, between corrosion and shipping and movement, it took a lot of work to get that restoration done. This was one before the change at the mall building, all the redo out there. Going back into the missile pit, for those who remember the missile pit down there in the Space Age Gallery down in the mall building, the V2 used to sit out on its own out on the floor. The V2 is now in the missile pit. Well, we thought when the missile was coming out this, we thought we knew the condition of it. We hadn't been inside of it in years. And we thought, that, okay, well, all we're going to need to do for the curator on this was we were going to repaint it. The paint job, when it was a paint job that was put on in America when we were post-war testing it, we wanted it to look more like the war model than it was. So this is the paint job that was on it when we received it. Here's the paint job that went on when it went out. But when we got in it, we didn't realize the guys in the 1970s, when they did a restoration in the 70s, because they wanted it to look a perfectly way, they were trying to remove some of that oil can effect, and it had a bunch of rips and gouges in it that we weren't aware of. It was covered in Bondo. There was hundreds of pounds of Bondo. When we chipped all the Bondo off the floor, we had hundreds of pounds of Bondo laying on the floor. And so, okay, now we know that. So then you have the decision, do you repair all those holes? We repaired some, just a few. But some of those holes, when we went and got historic photographs of V2s in use in the building, there's a hole, there's a rip, there's a paint, you know. And we're going to be honest with you, when we display it, we will tell the story that we think our V2 is a combination of this V2, that V2. This is one that went to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and they were using it to test up there, and it's pieces of it that was shipped to the museum. So, kind of like the Heinkel, we think it's a combination of pieces. They're all there, and they're correct. In fact, we hadn't even thought about it ourselves. The fuel tanks in the midsection had been sitting up at Garber at Silver Hill since, we think, the 60s. They were sitting in the back corner, and they just forgotten. The fuel tanks weren't in here from 1976 until about 2022 when we pulled it out. We put the fuel tanks back in. So it's actually more intact now than it was when we took it out. But what we thought was going to be about a month-long job turned into be about a 10-month job. But that was a very invasive restoration. So these are just some examples. The Lincoln or the IL-2 back here on the board that's in the shop, where we completely rebuilt the tail. That tail is the most accurate wood tail for any stormtrooper on the planet. Anyone else that's got a wood tail that they've reproduced, it's a faux tail, it's a tail that made to fly, it's a tail that made to look a certain way. We pulled out the illusion drawings, we actually had those. We had some docents at Hazi's who could read Russian, and they translated it for us. And the first thing the docents told us when they translated the Russian engineering drawings was, okay, now we need to go get some other Russians to speak, or Ukrainians to do some more translation for this mother. Why? It's Russian engineering, which for them was a whole other language, so we had to get all the technical stuff in place. So that tail on our Stormwind downtown is down to the millimeter. In fact, it's probably too perfect because they made those by hand in the field in the factories. Ours is probably better than they were actually making them during the war. To the point, I'll get to it. To the point where when we were painting, we had to go back and redo our paint because we knew the tails and the wings and the fuselage were actually made in different factory locations. They were brought together and put together. And when we look at the paint jobs and the paintings, the paint camo scheme where the line's supposed to just, they were actually be off by inches this way or that way because they just, it's warping. It doesn't matter. Slap it back together. So when our guys first did it, we're like, that don't look right. It's not supposed to be that good. Go back. You gotta make it look more rough. So that was a level of accuracy we wanted. But we had a lot of pictures of Stormwind because I don't know if everyone knows, that was the most numerous military aircraft ever made. So there's a lot of iterations of it, a lot of units it served in. So we had to do a lot of thought about what ours would look like. Yes, sir.
What about the adhesive that you use?
Okay, good question. The only thing not accurate on our tail is the adhesive, and there was a technical reason for that. We tried to use the casing glue. Everyone know what casing glue is? The original, why there's a cowl and Elmer's glue?
So they use casing as well as us.